Hey guys, what's up? I'm Noah, this is Analog Resurgence, and today we're finally talking about 8mm motion picture film. So have you ever been in like a thrift store or like a camera store and you've eyed something that looks maybe a little bit like this kind of camera and you've thought, ooh, that's a sleek looking Super 8 camera, only to pick it up, open up the actual film compartment, and inside, instead of taking Super 8 cartridges like I've always talked about, it takes these little reels. Now again, for reference, Super 8 film looks like this. It comes in a plastic cartridge, and it goes inside of cameras like these that have a film compartment on the side where you pop these cartridges in. Easy to load, easy to use, and different from 8mm film. 8mm cameras have film compartments like these, and the film itself actually comes to you on these little reels, not a cartridge. So you can't use Super 8 film in an 8mm camera, and you also can't use 8mm film in a Super 8 camera. Different film, not interchangeable, but also very similar. 16mm film was introduced by Kodak in 1923, but if we jump ahead almost a decade to 1932, Kodak introduced a newer, smaller format for taking motion picture film. This was 8mm, and 8mm was introduced as a cheaper alternative to 16mm so that amateurs could use it. And 16mm was introduced as a cheaper format to 35mm so amateurs could use that as well. Things just kept getting smaller and cheaper. So it's surprising that after 8mm we didn't just get Super 4mm instead. Also, to avoid any sort of confusion before I get too deep into this topic, 8mm film goes by a few different names, but it is all the same kind of film. So sometimes you'll just hear it referred to as 8mm film, but it can also be called regular 8mm film, standard 8mm film, and double 8mm film. All the same kind of film, all the same kind of cameras take it. Don't confuse that with single 8mm film, because that's a Fujifilm format that is a topic for another time. So 8mm, regular 8, double 8, and standard 8, but not single 8 or Super 8. You got it? Because we're moving on, and I'm probably going to end up using a bunch of the different names for it interchangeably throughout the video. So 8mm came into existence, and a lot of people were using it to shoot like home movies and just smaller amateur stuff because of how small and easy to use it was and cheap. And they were doing that in the 40s and the 50s, all the way up into the 60s when Super 8 was introduced as the successor to 8mm in 1965. So like I said, instead of like a cartridge like Super 8 film, 8mm film comes on actual little reels of film. Pretty similar to what you would see for like a 100-foot reel of 16mm film as well, just on these rolls. It means that you can load this film in subdued daylight. Just because it's on a little roll doesn't mean that you need to be in a complete dark room or like use a dark bag. You can load it in like not full direct sunlight necessarily, but you don't have to be in complete darkness. And this is just because of the way the film is rolled, and the inner roll is protected by like the outer few feet. So you're gonna lose a couple of feet when you load the camera, but that's normal. So regular 8mm film just comes on little spools of 25 feet of film, or technically closer to like 30 or 32 feet of film. There's just a little bit of excess on there to account for the amount that you'll lose when you're loading the film. So 8mm film looks like this. It's 16mm film in terms of width, but it has double the number of perforations or sprocket holes down both sides of the film. But for actually shooting 8mm film, it works a little bit differently from just shooting a roll of 16 in a Bolex. And this is the unique part of 8mm film. So you take your little roll of 8mm film and you load it into your camera. Inside the film compartment, 8mm cameras look similar to certain 16mm cameras as well, like the inside of a Bolex. The fresh roll of film goes in the top spot here. It feeds down through the camera, and you need a second empty reel on the bottom for your take-up. So as you shoot your 25 feet of film through your camera, the film moves from the top reel through the camera down to the bottom spool. And shooting 25 feet of film through this camera is about 2 minutes worth of footage. Now once you're done, this is where things get interesting. You have to actually open up your camera and remove the film like you normally would, but then you swap the reels and you put that film back in the top spot and shoot it all over again for another 2 minutes. Okay, this isn't like double exposing your film or doing anything weird like that. I mean, as long as you do it right. I've seen people make crazy mistakes, which again for film is fine. It has no rules. It's the Wild West over here. But also knowing how this stuff actually works is really important and really helpful. How it actually works is that you're shooting 16mm wide film. You shoot it through the camera first and it exposes one side of the 16mm width. Then when you actually open up your camera, remove the film, flip it, and then shoot it again, you're shooting frames down the other side of that film. Then once you're done shooting this single roll of 8mm twice through your camera, you take it out and it's ready to be developed. And it needs to be developed by a lab that's capable of handling motion picture film, or you can experiment with developing this yourself at home. And the really important part here is that once that 16mm wide film is developed, it actually gets slit down the middle with a little blade and turned into two 8mm wide pieces of film. And then those two 8mm pieces of film are spliced together, and then it is one long continuous roll of regular 8mm. And that is, it's kind of wild. 8mm film is really special in the way that it gets shot and then handled so that it goes from 16mm to 8mm. And it's really cool and like pretty unique in the way that it's just handled like that. Now in terms of like handling how to slit the film down the middle if you're developing film at home, now it is of course 16mm wide initially, so you need a tank that can handle that, and that can be something like the Morse tank, which can hold 16mm film. But slitting 25 feet of 16mm film at home is the part that's a little more difficult. I'll link some stuff in the description. There's a website I found that talked about making its own film slitter, just using like a blade and like a container to hold the film. Little vintage ones like the KMV film slitter are not necessarily like the easiest things to track down. So regular 8mm cameras typically run at 16 frames per second. In comparison, the standard for super 8mm cameras is 18 frames per second. So there's a little bit of a speed difference between the two formats. And when you shoot 16 frames per second for an entire roll of 8mm film, which when spliced together and finished is 50 feet in total, then you will get about 4 minutes worth of footage off of one roll of 8mm film. So the main thing here is that you're loading one roll twice in order to shoot the entire thing through an 8mm camera. Now you do have to be a little careful when you're removing it for the first time and then flipping it and reshooting it, because again, you're going to expose a few feet at the end of the first time you've shot it, which when you splice those pieces together is like a blank spot right in the middle. But of course, sometimes labs will be nice and will just cut out that wasted section of film. And that's kind of why 8mm comes on rolls that are slightly bigger than 25 feet of film, so that it kind of compensates for the amount that you lose when you're loading it and flipping it and then unloading it. Now once it's cut in half, the 8mm wide film has a frame that sits between the two perforations, which is also how 16mm frames are exposed onto that film as well. But in comparison, Super 8 film has a frame that sits right beside the sprocket hole, so it's little indicators like that that help you to kind of tell the difference between the formats. So when you compare 8mm to 16mm, it can actually fit 4 frames in the space that 16mm cameras will fit 1. And that's a pretty big cost cut. And the price difference between regular 8mm in comparison to 16mm meant that more people could afford to shoot their home movies on 8mm during a little thing that we like to call the Great Depression. Having the cheaper format of 8mm up against 16mm around that time when things were very hard means that today more footage exists from that period of time than would if only 16mm existed. And of course 8mm was great for shooting your own like beautiful home movies around that period of time too, especially when Kodak introduced Kodachrome for 8mm. So a lot of 8mm cameras are pretty old at this point. They are largely mechanical and ran off of spring-wound motors inside of them. Many don't have built-in light meters, and instead you use something like an exposure guide that most cameras have like on the front or the side of them. This also means that like a lot of these regular 8mm cameras, even if they're nothing like super special, are kind of built to last. Like, these are solid cameras. They can have really solid mechanics and just components inside of them. In comparison, later on, once Super 8 cameras started to hit the market in like the mid-60s and into the 70s and the 80s, it was far more common for people to be able to make Super 8 cameras on the cheap using like just bad plastic components and stuff that is not uncommon to have degraded over time if you're picking one up today. And Super 8 cameras largely run off of AA batteries, whereas again, these guys are all spring wound for the motors. You just wind them up, just kind of like early 16mm cameras as well, and then all you have to do is just hold it down and run the motor. It's also easier to find models of 8mm cameras that will take interchangeable lenses as well, whereas Super 8 cameras just usually had a built-in zoom lens. And of course, in comparison, 8mm cameras would be prime lenses. So you could get some really nice lenses for shooting on 8mm that can outperform Super 8 cameras. So there are some really nice regular 8mm cameras out there. There are early ones like the Cine Kodak 8, which is like one of the first ones introduced. And there's a ton of Bell & Howell 8mm cameras from over the years. They also made like Super 8 cameras and just like a ton of this stuff in general. There's ones like the Bell & Howell 252, which has a turret to hold 3 separate lenses, which is just like a 16mm camera. There are also ones made from Bolex, and Bolex of course made tons of great 16mm cameras. And some of their 8mm cameras are also like some of the best ones out there for the format. And models like the P1 and the K1 are probably definitely worth checking out if you're interested in buying one for yourself. Also, Bolex made the H8 cameras, which are like almost identical to their 16mm cameras. H8 cameras would take 100-foot rolls of 8mm film, which when you slit and spliced it together was 200 feet of 8mm. Now right now though, you're pretty limited for buying 100-foot rolls of 8mm. The Film Photography Project sells black and white 8mm film in 100-foot rolls though, so if you're really looking to feed those nice old H8 Bolex models, then the Film Photography Project is definitely worth checking out. Film Photography Project is putting out color negative film for 8mm, but they're also putting out Ektachrome Color Reversal, the brand new stuff from a couple years ago that was reintroduced in 8mm film rolls for your cameras, so you can feed those old school projectors as well when you're shooting this stuff. Seriously, Film Photography Project is great. A few months ago, they actually sent me a roll of 50D color negative film for 8mm. So, you know, once I'm done shooting this video, I'm gonna load this film up, and at some point pretty soon, we're gonna take a look at this stuff once it's processed and scanned. If you wanna feed these 8mm cameras, I don't know of another better resource than them. I'm gonna shoot this stuff, Michael. I have not forgotten. This is coming your way soon, I promise. So regular 8mm film is not dead. It is very much worth like picking up one of these nice little cameras, usually for not very much, and now you can shoot color negative film stock and like Ektachrome and black and white on this stuff. It's definitely taken a backseat to Super 8 film though. In 1965, Super 8 was introduced as kind of like the successor or replacement for 8mm film, and it didn't necessarily like kill the format because they didn't just immediately like discontinue all existence of it. Kodak kept making their own regular 8mm film up until like the 1990s from what I found. But Super 8 does have its advantages over 8mm film. So when they introduced Super 8, it changed a few things. Instead of being 16mm wide, it was just 8mm and loaded into these plastic cartridges. Super 8 film has smaller perforations on the side, which allowed for a bigger frame size to be exposed. So Super 8 has a 50% larger frame in comparison to regular 8mm film. So you can capture more detail on a Super 8 frame size in comparison to a regular 8 frame. So the trade-off between the two formats though is that regular 8mm cameras can be more solid and more reliable and last longer in comparison to Super 8 cameras, which have plastic components and electronics inside them that can degrade and break and just stop working. Super 8 film also comes inside these plastic cartridges, so you can't really rewind the film or double expose the film or any of that experimental, more like fun side of things, which you can do on 8mm film because it just comes on these reels that you can play around with a little more. So the freedom of having your film on a reel and that you can kind of like handle a little easier is like a big positive in terms of shooting on 8mm. So I'd say there's like points on both sides here in terms of this stuff, because even though Super 8 has a bigger frame size, 8mm can have nicer lenses, so you can still capture great looking images on 8mm instead of Super 8. And because Super 8 and 8mm are both the same width, they can both go through a lot of the same Super 8 projectors. Now 8mm projectors can't take Super 8 film, but Super 8 projectors can usually take 8mm film. The older vintage 8mm projectors can't handle Super 8 because of the smaller perforations. But if you're looking at Super 8 projectors, then make sure that they have some sort of switch between standard and super film so that you can use it to project both formats. And when you're looking to buy an 8mm camera, keep an eye out for ones that actually only take magazines. These are ones to avoid. So you can still get 8mm film on these reels. But for a period, they were making 8mm film in magazines like these, and these are metal magazines. Inside of it, it is film that is 16mm wide, and it has the 8mm frame size on it. So you just have to put the magazine in, take the magazine out, flip it, shoot it back in again, and then you're good to go. So it's just like normal 8mm film, but it's only in magazines. So if you have one of these 8mm cameras that take these magazines, then pretty much your options are to just kind of like reuse them and load 8mm film from a roll into a magazine instead, which can kind of be more trouble than it's worth sometimes. So I would still just kind of recommend looking for ones that just take the reels. There was also briefly an alternative to 8mm before Super 8, which was just called Straight 8, not to be confused with Fuji's Single 8. Straight 8 was film that was already cut to 8mm in width, so you didn't have to flip it halfway through and get it slit down the middle, but it was short-lived. There were really only like a handful of cameras that took the Straight 8 format. Things like the Bell & Howell Filmo 127A took it, but it did have more popularity outside of North America in places like Europe and the Soviet Union, because companies like Agfa and Svema were making Straight 8 film. Now, as for sound on film, it's pretty rare for 8mm. There were like a very, very, very small number of cameras that could record on 8mm film if it had sound magnetic striping down it to capture audio. But that came much later in 8mm's lifespan, and it was definitely not the most popular thing. In my research, I was only able to find reference to like one specific camera that could record magnetic audio on special 8mm film, and that was the Cinephonic. But other than that, it looks like your home movies are gonna remain silent for this period of time. So don't count out the possibility of shooting 8mm film at the moment, because there are options. From Film Photography Project makes some. There's also Fomapan makes some special 8mm black and white film that you can pick up as well. Kodak stopped making their own actual 8mm film stocks in the 1990s, so you're not going to be getting it from companies like that. And I mean, depending on what you're using and shooting and like where you're located, shooting 8mm film could also come in under the cost of shooting a format like Super 8 instead as well. Now, if you're buying your own 8mm camera, the best things to look for are just being able to wind it up on the side and test to see if the motor is running. You can also flip open the film gate on certain models and make sure that things are moving in there and that it's exposing through the lens. With things like 8mm and Super 8 and 16, it's always really important to shoot a test roll and experiment first and make sure that things are moving properly, because there's always little things that could happen inside of the camera when you're actually shooting film that aren't always evident when you're just kind of playing around with it and testing it without film. So this little format is kind of unique, and there's film for it, and there's great cameras out there. It's definitely worth picking up and maybe experimenting with it, and also kind of just using it as an example to kind of understand where Super 8 came from and just, you know, the evolution of film types in general. But I would definitely recommend that people like experiment more with this stuff and play more with it, because it is overlooked in terms of stacking it up against Super 8, because everybody loves Super 8 and wants to get into Super 8 from what I've seen at least. But 8mm is definitely still worth it. And of course, in the future, I'll be talking more about the format, and hopefully I'll be shooting the 50D here that I have, and I'll do a little bit more about loading the camera specifically in future videos, and then we'll be hopefully taking a look at some footage pretty soon as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have experience with 8mm film, if you've got some 8mm camera recommendations, then I want to hear about it down in the comments below. Also, let me know if you have experience developing it at home, because people are looking for information on how to like slit the film down from 16 to 8mm. There's also information for the Patreon and the PO box if you have like a nice little package of some expired film or some interesting stuff that you want to send to the channel, or if you want to support the channel in any way, then you can find that information down in the description below. There's also a link in the description for Pro 8mm out in California. They're a lab. They do things more on the side of Super 8 and 16mm stuff, so if you're looking for that stuff instead of 8mm, then you can head over there and check them out. They're also a lab, so they can process stuff, they'll transfer stuff. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all soon.
Hey guys, I gotta do the Patreon shoutouts because it's the end of May and the beginning of June. and I haven't had a chance to do them just yet, but I haven't forgotten. A special shout out, thank you to Abby Henderson, Alex Onken, Palazzo Sue, Benjamin MacArthur, Bearded, Bingling Zoo, Carson Fuller, Caesar, Chalian Chris, Cha Zolling, Chris Rasmussen, Chris Rohr, Colin Jackson, Dan Gross, David Piranelli, Derek Konigsberg, Edwin Goodwin, Emma Clydon, Eric Machen Christensen, Futigu, Gaurav Pai, Juliana Lepedalina, Graham Sheffer, Henry and Megan, Ian Farver, Ian Frank, Jeremy Lee Camp, Larry Ober, Matthew Ellers, Nakia Jones, Natalie Etienne, Nick, Purple Doug, Ramblings from Canada, Rose Suet DeMorris, Ryan Peters, Sam Davison, Sean Williams, the Super 8 Skateboard Company, Taylor Brown, Taylor Cusella, Thomas Wibley, Tiago Almanca, and Travis Tobin. An extra special shout out to those of you over on the Patreon who went above and beyond and helped support the channel even a little bit more. For Chalian Chris, Taylor Brown, Eric Machen Christensen, Tiago Almanca, Carson Fuller, David Piranelli, and the Super 8 Skateboard Company, for which next month I will go back to actually getting some slides done for those on the higher tier, now that I can actually get to a lab a little bit easier. But thank you as always, and I'll see everybody next week.